Good afternoon. Welcome to our Kansas Senate Candidate Forum for Districts 2, 3, and 19. My name is Ursula Minor, and I am the Lawrence Branch NAACP President. I want to give a special thank you to the League of Women Voters of Lawrence and Douglas County for partnering with the NAACP and hosting these forums. Because our organizations are nonpartisan, our political activities are focused on voter registration, voter education, and most importantly, voter turnout at the polls. We appreciate the support of the Lawrence Public Library and Kansas Public Radio. Let's review this afternoon's format for our candidates and the audience. The questions I will ask were developed by members of the NAACP and the League of Women Voters. Each candidate received the questions in advance. Each candidate will have a specific amount of time to answer the questions. There will be no additional questions from the audience. Instead, we have asked the candidates to stay after their formal question and answer period so that you can visit with them. The League of Women Voters and the NAACP cannot endorse candidates, but all the candidates are free to share campaign materials, seek volunteers, and answer additional questions. Our timekeeper is Carol, over there with the stop sign, and she will let the candidate know when there are 15 seconds left to respond. And then when the time is up, we respectfully ask the candidates to stay within the time allotted for each question. Let me introduce our candidates. Democratic candidates Marcy Francisco from Senate District 2 and Dina Sattler from Senate District 3 are present. Senator Francisco's Republican opponent, David Miller. Mr. Miller sent the following statement in an email. As you may know, I have participated in the political process for many years. I have endeavored to live by faith-based beliefs. Especially, I have never wanted to campaign on the Lord's Day as part of the walk. Therefore, I do not plan to attend the event. I note you will provide the questions in advance. I will do my best to respond with answers so that they may be shared with the attendees. NAACP member Jerry Jost will read Mr. Miller's responses. Ms. Sattler's Republican opponent, Rick Kloos. Mr. Kloos did not respond to repeated emails, voice messages, and text. The Republican candidate for Senate District 19, Tyler Weibel, sent the following statement. I apologize for not being here in person. As a religious man, I do not campaign on the Sabbath and in respect of mine and other religious beliefs. I want to thank everyone for being informed and their voting decisions, for taking your time to be at events like these, working along with thanking everyone that works so diligently in these organizations like these to make sure their members and communities have the chance to be informed and involved in voicing their concerns and where the communities, state, and nation are headed. NAACP member Lois Orth Lopes will read Mr. Weibel's responses. In Senate District 19, Democratic candidate Patrick Schmidt is unavailable to be here today. He has sent the following statement. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Your work is essential to strengthening our democracy. Since beginning my journey into elective politics, it's become increasingly clear that forces who wish to turn back our progress are determined to win at all cost. To do so, they are working overtime to roll back many of our hard-fought rights, from access to the ballot box, access to reproductive health care, and a fair chance for admission to colleges and universities. Their goal is simple: make it so difficult for people to oppose them to do so than to give up and acquiesce to their whims. But we aren't going back. I wish I would have joined you here today in person, but prior to scheduling conflicts prevent me from doing so. I am thankful for the hard work you do and look forward to seeing you again in the near future. If elected to the Senate, I will work diligently to ensure that our progress has not eroded and we continue to advance the cause for all in the fight. Because when we fight, we win. Thank you. Okay, so let's begin. This is our first question. Question number 1. What are your priorities and opportunities related to natural resources and energy in the upcoming session? David, you have 90 seconds. we'll begin with Marcy. Sorry.
There's a lot I'd like the legislature to do. The additional funding for the state water plan will need to be reappropriated every year to continue the investments in our reservoirs, establishing riparian buffers to reduce contaminants, and implement injection dredging. Reports from the underground or groundwater management districts can help us understand if they're following through on goals to reduce irrigation water use to protect and extend the life of our aquifers. We need to ensure that we're honoring the senior water rights held by the Quivira Wildlife Refuge. House Bill 2541 was introduced last year on behalf of Kansans for Conservation, 39 groups across the state, ranging from the Kansas Farm Bureau to the Kansas Land Trust, would appropriate additional funds for conservation to draw down federal funds to significantly increase resources for conservation activities. I'd like to see adoption of a statewide building code with strict standards for energy efficiency. At a minimum, we should require those standards for housing projects funded with state grants. That statewide building code could be a first step in developing a state energy plan. And since agriculture is the largest sector of our state's economy, we should ensure that information and resources are available for the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices that can reduce inputs and increase soil health and longevity.
Thank you. Next we have David.
I will read David Miller's written response. The oil and natural gas industry is a vital, important part of our state's economy. We should promote abundant energy production so affordable energy is available to every Kansan. The National Democrat administration has discouraged energy production, which is a key cause of the horrible inflation that has affected nearly everyone. Affordable energy is key to taming inflation. I was glad to learn the legislature passed a law to ensure that we have the right to cook our meals and heat our dwellings with natural gas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Dina.
Our energy needs here in Kansas and the nation are growing every day. I have always supported a diversified portfolio of all energy sources. Kansas has a long tradition of being a leader in oil production and exports, and that's important as our nation works to lessen its dependence on foreign oil. At the same time, Kansas is primed to take significant steps forward in transitioning to less dependence on fossil fuels and expanding clean energy sources when and where possible. In doing so, it's also necessary to respect local property owners' interests and concerns. We also know that for too long, our state's leaders have not been good stewards of our natural resources. Water, both the quantity and quality of water, is a pressing concern statewide. Left unaddressed, the water crisis will threaten the viability of our agriculture industry and our entire economy. I very much look forward to working with the Kansas Geological Society at KU to learn more about our Kansas unique strengths, as well as our challenges when it comes to natural resources. And I look forward to discussing Kansas-specific approaches to sensible legislation that leads to lower energy costs for families and businesses, improves energy security, and provides reliable energy sources for the region now and in the future.
Thank you. Next we have Tyler.
I will be reading Tyler Weibel's responses. Nature preservation is huge to me. As someone who is a hiking and camping enthusiast, I want to make sure future generations get to see the beauty of this great state has to offer. Luckily, we are not subject to the lithium strip mining in this state because this absolutely obliterates the ecosystems to an irreversible state. That being said, with our vast open spaces, we see a growth in wind and solar farms that take up vast amounts of land and hurt our natural climate and ecosystems. There has to be a way to produce energy in a cleaner way that preserves our land and will create a greener future. As of right now, science shows that nuclear power is the cleanest, safest, and most efficient source of power production we have. With the new findings of nuclear fuel recycling, we are moving towards the future of not having to mine for more nuclear materials as well, which lands us in an even greener and eco-friendlier energy-producing future.
Thank you. Next we'll go to question 2. What would you like to see happen in the legislature to protect women's health and reproductive justice for all Kansans? You have 90 seconds. We'll begin with David's response.
I will read David Miller's written response. It is now clear the Kansas Supreme Court will continue to eliminate any limitations on abortion. Accordingly, I doubt any legislation to protect mothers and infants will survive court challenges. I will address the health part of this question in question number 5. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Dina.
To start, we need to elect common sense Democrats to break the Republican supermajority that works every day to attack our freedoms, to include a woman's freedom to make her own decisions about her body. Kansans spoke loudly and clearly 2 years ago in rejecting Republicans' blatant attack on women's reproductive rights. Yet Republicans in the legislature, my opponent included, won't give up. They are relentless in trying to control women, to include in the last session overriding vetoes of 3 bills designed to pressure and intimidate patients and providers alike. These extremists are determined to make women, your daughters, your granddaughters, second-class citizens. They want to control them and make decisions for them. It's ridiculous to hear Republicans say they are the party of small government because they're in our bedrooms, they're in our bathrooms, they're in our doctor's office visits, and they're truly the party of overreach. Enough is enough. They need to understand no means no. And 2 years ago, Kansas, again, spoke loudly and clearly in protecting women's reproductive rights. From day one, I will acknowledge and respect the will of the people in our state and fight for our freedom to make our own personal medical decisions.
Thank you. Next, we have Tyler.
This is Tyler Weibel's response. I believe abortion is needed in the cases of rape, incest, and protection of the mother. We need to rid the stigma of it being used purely as a contraceptive and realize that we wouldn't have this stigma if we actually had a middle class. We are in an economic state of being haves and have-nots, which increases the appeal of abortion in the eyes of the hardly being able to afford to live, let alone afford a child. As we better our economy and the lives of Kansans, we will see a natural drop in abortion rates. I would like to better the lives of Kansas and our economy, our economic state, to see our true reproductive issues before we start talking about laws that affect women's health and reproduction.
Thank you. Next, we have Marcy.
I will continue to support maternal, reproductive, and gender-affirming health care. That starts with my continued support for expansion of CanCare, the state-specific proposal for Medicaid expansion. Its passage would help out our hospitals, support healthcare providers, and eliminate some uncompensated care, reducing insurance costs for everyone. Healthcare available to a woman before she becomes pregnant increases the chances for healthy delivery. I would like the legislature to review the data regarding discrepancies in maternal health outcomes for women of color and implement programs to reduce those discrepancies. I do plan to reintroduce the contents of Senate Bill 206 that Senator Holland and I introduced in 2023 to address Kansas abortion law, with updates to address the recent Kansas Supreme Court decisions. Kansas voters overwhelmingly support bodily autonomy. We need to stop the attacks on reproductive health care and let healthcare providers know that we support their response in emergency situations, but also need to allow a health insurance policy to cover the cost of treatment, especially in reproductive health emergencies. And there should be no one-sided treatment of donations. Donations for the services provided for women by Planned Parenthood should be given the same tax donation status as those provided for pro-life groups and clinics.
Thank you. Next, we'll have question number 3. What is your opinion about using public funding for private schools? You have 90 seconds. We will begin with Dina.
I strongly oppose the school voucher scheme that would shift our taxpayer dollars to private schools with no accountability. Extreme right Republicans, my opponent included, are determined to pass school vouchers in the coming session. This scam would deliberately weaken our neighborhood schools by diverting our taxpayer dollars to private schools without the same accountability as our public schools. Vouchers also undermine the educational opportunities for disabled and special education students and result in segregation of our schools. The good news is the state has fully funded education for 6 years in a row. And while there was some progress made in funding special education, which Republicans also tried to stonewall, there still is much work to do in funding for special education needs. Instead of pushing ways to undermine our neighborhood schools, legislators need to focus on opportunities to strengthen early education, invest in career and technical programs at the middle and high school levels, and further strengthen partnerships between high schools and community colleges that prepare our young graduates for careers of the future right here in Kansas, which in turn will strengthen our communities. I am honored to be endorsed by the passionate advocates for public education in our state, the Kansas National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, and Game On Kansas.
Thank you. Next, we have Tyler.
This is Tyler Weibel's response. This is a stigma that needs to be abolished. Public funding is taxes, taxes that we all pay. The first thing we need is the federal government out of our Kansas school system and to establish regulations to put our tax dollars into the classrooms and not into the pockets of the administration. With this, you should have a choice on where your child goes and the quality of education in the environment of your choosing. School districts are districted in Kansas off of white flight of the 60s, and this causes inner city schools to be overpopulated with minimal funding. The wealth needs to be distributed evenly, and parents should all have the right to a choice over their child's well-being and learning, giving families in poverty the ability to have their kids in private school systems if they choose, which is not what we have seen up to this point.
Thank you. Next, we have Marcy.
I do not support using public funding for private schools. The legislature must be able to be held accountable for the state expenditures they authorize. There is no assurance that private schools will allow equal access to education. The ability to pick and choose students leaves many, especially those with special needs other than gifted, out. It is very important to have provisions for special education. Unfortunately, the legislature is hindering overall public education when we don't meet the requirement to fund 92% of special education excess costs, because those additional expenditures must then come out of base state aid. Discussions for a new funding formula are likely to start in the upcoming session because the existing school finance formula sunsets in 2027. I support continuation of the current funding formula with additional flexibility for districts faced with either increasing or decreasing enrollments, giving school boards time to make budget adjustments. I also want to see state funding cover the costs of free school meals and early childhood education if they're not provided through federal funds, giving all students a better opportunity to learn.
Thank you. Next, we have David.
I will read David Miller's written response. Children are the right and responsibility of the parents. The money we appropriate comes from the parents and should be focused on the children. We should help parents raise their children rather than deem the children public property.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to question number 4. What changes to current Kansas statutes should be made to promote voter registration and turnout and encourage more civic engagement and confidence in our election systems? You have 90 seconds. We'll begin with Tyler's response.
This is Tyler Weibel's response. We all have a fear that our votes don't count anymore. We fear about fraudulent elections and turnouts. This is why we need proper identification regulations when it comes to registering to vote. This will decrease our uneasiness at the polls on whether our votes are actually counted or fraudulent. We also need all voting to be in person with public transportation free to voting locations and homes on Election Day. Unless a medical physician deems you unfit to do so and can provide a doctor's note stating your need, I'm sorry, let me try this. What he's saying is, unless there's a medical physician deems you unfit to do so and can provide a doctor's note stating your need for a mail-in ballot. So unless you need a mail-in ballot, you should be voting on Election Day. I'm sorry, I messed that up.
Next, we will have Marcy.
Voting is the most fundamental right we hold as Kansans and Americans. I would like to see same-day registration allowed in Kansas. Voters taking advantage of that registration would be using provisional ballots, giving our county election officials and canvassing boards opportunities to confirm eligibility. Until we have same-day registration in Kansas, however, I would like the provisions allowing canvassing boards to count provisional ballots from registered voters who have moved within the same county be expanded so that they can count them from registered voters who have moved from anywhere else within the state. If you're currently a registered voter in Kansas, that provisional ballot application will update your residence and the board should be allowed to count your vote. The legislature should require all counties to have weekend voting hours during the advance voting period. And we learned just this week, Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab released a statement confirming that over 1,000 ballots in the 2024 primary election were ruled invalid because of mail delivery delays. Because of the current delays in mail processing, the recently enacted limit on the number of ballots any one person may return to an election office or a ballot drop box should be increased. We know that not everyone is able to get out and vote in person, and even someone just helping their parent in a nursing home should also be able to help that parent's friends when asked.
Thank you. Next, we have David.
I will read David Miller's written response. I have been a longtime advocate for the wide civic participation in our state. It is important that we have secure elections free of fraud. We must make sure our voter rolls are accurate. I know from my campaign experience here in Lawrence that this issue badly needs attention. I have witnessed firsthand numerous incidents of registrants no longer residing at listed addresses. Accurate voter rolls are critical to honest elections. This needs attention.
Next, we'll move to question 4. What changes to current Kansas statutes should be made to promote voter registration and turnout and encourage more civic engagement and confidence in our election systems? And actually, we already did that one. Next, we have Dina. Sorry
There we
about
go,
that.
yeah. We all should be shocked and embarrassed by the recent low turnout for the primary election. It's proof that the focus has to be on getting more Kansans to the polls. Republican extremists know low turnout usually benefits their candidates, which is why they work to make it harder to vote, when we all should instead focus on increasing voting and civic engagement. In the Senate, I will fight against voter suppression measures and support ways to encourage Kansans to vote, getting young Kansans registered to vote and promoting early voting. That means educating Kansans on how they have the power to enact change that improves their lives and their communities. Every U.S. citizen should have the freedom to vote. You will hear extremists say there's some sort of effort to flood the polls with undocumented immigrants when no such thing has ever happened. Former Secretary of State Kobach was obsessed with finding waves of undocumented immigrants voting and never did. Kansas's current Secretary of State, a Republican, has said Kansas's elections are safe and secure, and he's correct. We all should agree on the importance of increasing civic engagement. I participated in the recent Kansas Civics Games sponsored by the Kansas Press Association that had high school teams from across Kansas tackling state, local, and national government topics. We need more positive programs of this kind to increase citizen engagement. What we don't need are constant lies and fear-mongering by extremists determined to make it harder to vote and disenfranchise vulnerable Kansans as a way to improve their own chances at the polls.
Thank you. Next, we have question number 5. What are the opportunities and challenges with advancing legislation on topics such as Medicaid expansion, legalization of marijuana, and LGBTQ rights? You have 2 minutes. We will begin with Marcy.
Unfortunately, the majority party in the legislature controls what bills are heard in committees and debated on the floor. If party leadership is against particular legislation, they can ensure it's not acted on. With what is referred to as a supermajority, enough members in a party to override a veto, there is even less incentive for that leadership to work with the governor from the opposite party. The effort during this election campaign to end the current supermajorities in the House and Senate is to put pressure on that leadership to compromise with the governor. Expanding Medicaid would bring some $600 million a year more to the state because of increased reimbursement rates for new recipients, increases that would also benefit healthcare providers. Current Republican leadership seems to have dug in their heels, and moderates who have supported expansion over the years have lost seats in primary elections. With the states surrounding Kansas making cannabis legal, there is increased pressure for Kansas to do the same. We have seen the harm caused by opioids and should certainly allow medical marijuana as a much safer alternative for seizures and chronic pain. We should clean up outdated and unconstitutional statutes, especially those targeted at LGBTQ+ individuals. Anti-sodomy laws should have been removed decades ago. A statewide non-discrimination employment ordinance should be enacted, and since gay marriage is legal throughout the United States because of the Federal Respect for Marriage Act, the legislature should allow for a vote to remove this constitutional prohibition on same-sex marriage. Unfortunately, a legislature unwilling to respond to the will of the majority of Kansans on such issues is unlikely to allow a vote to create ballot initiatives, something I would support. My opponent claims Lawrence would be better served by a Republican state senator, but that would make ending the supermajority in the Senate even harder. I believe the district would be best served by an active member of the community and one who shows up for her job.
Thank you. Next, we have David.
I will read David Miller's written response. I have been disgusted to see the real results of the federal ACA legislation. Medical insurance has simply become unaffordable for many Kansans. Medical insurance premiums have skyrocketed. It is clear the promise to make coverage affordable was just a lie. Rather, I believe its purpose was to make more people more dependent on more government. That helps ensure that people are financially dependent on the ruling political establishment. One reason I like public service is that I want to help people. I want people to be independent, not dependent. I would gladly work to approve a Medicaid expansion program if, and only if, it has a meaningful work requirement for able-bodied adults. Work is good. It brings dignity. Normally, I would not support expanding government, but I believe we should consider this in order to help Kansans and small Kansas businesses secure medical insurance coverage.
Thank you. Next, we have Dina.
Medicaid expansion is long overdue in Kansas. There is simply no sensible reason for Republicans to continue to block access to health care for some 152,000 Kansans, including 40,000 children. It's immoral and it's irresponsible. Kansans in need of affordable health care are largely the working poor who struggle every day to make ends meet. And yet Republican legislators blocking Medicaid expansion enjoy generous health care benefits paid for by us, the taxpayers, and refuse to help those less fortunate. Plus, we have sent more than $7 billion of our own taxpayer dollars to other states, helping to pay for health care of residents in places like Illinois and California. That makes no sense. We can be fiscally responsible and still care for our friends and neighbors. That's the Kansas way. But my opponent naturally opposes Medicaid expansion, raising claims that it will go to undocumented immigrants, still more ridiculous fear-mongering and hate-driven opinions. As for legalization of marijuana, Kansas must at least start with medical marijuana. Blocking it is just another attack on our freedom. Ailing Kansans should be free to work with their physicians on ways to ease their pain and alleviate other symptoms. Medical marijuana would help patients suffering from serious ailments such as epilepsy, seizures, cancer, Alzheimer's, and mental health challenges. We also need meaningful discussion on ending the state's prohibition on recreational marijuana. Fort Hays State University's annual public opinion survey showed 67.2% of Kansans support recreational sale of marijuana for people 21 and older. And on LGBTQ rights. First of all, I abhor discrimination of every kind. Discrimination simply is not in line with our Kansas values. Republican extremists spend inordinate time on culture wars that, again, are nothing more than fear-mongering. By doing so, they embarrass our state by presenting Kansas as backward and uninviting. That's no way to encourage positive economic growth in our communities and our state. Their unwarranted attacks on LGBTQ Kansans make people feel unsafe in their own communities, which cannot be tolerated. I will fight for policies that protect freedoms for all, not just a select few as determined by a handful of extreme right Republicans.
Thank you. Next, we have Tyler.
This is Tyler Weibel's response. Medicaid reconstruction, not Medicaid expansion, needs to be our focus. Medicaid expansion is trying to throw money at a failing system that will lead us into a state of debt. We need to first fix Medicaid to make it sustainable before we ever look at expanding it. Insurance is completely unaffordable because the government is in it. Requiring health insurance and then the government getting into health insurance has been the biggest scam to the United States people to this date. All this accomplished was a price increase in insurance, higher taxes, higher U.S. debts, uninsured Americans, and insurance companies with bulging pockets. We need to get the government out of the healthcare system and actually make healthcare affordable again. Marijuana shouldn't be off the table, but we can't legalize it without proper regulations, which we have seen fail and crumble in both Colorado and Oklahoma, causing an influx in the Chinese mob and organized crime surrounding marijuana production in the United States. We can see legal marijuana happen in Kansas, but we need to learn from the mistakes of other states and fix the holes. The biggest thing in legislation towards the LGBT community right now is the laws they are wanting to pass making bodily mutilation illegal for adolescents. If you can't vote or have legal rights before the age of 18 and you can't smoke or drink until 21 because your brain is not fully developed to make educated choices, then we have to follow the same thinking. Puberty makes things tough. You are changing hormonally and mentally, and you are setting out on a journey of figuring out who you are as a person in society. This is not the time to mutilate your body. Be fully set in who you are as a person and what you want. Then, as an adult, make any decision you want, fully informed on who you are.
Thank you. We'll go to question number 6, which is the last question. Are there any other issues you would like to address today? You have 1 minute. We'll start with David.
I will read David Miller's response. As I informed you, I have tried over my years in public life to avoid political work on the Lord's Day. Sadly, you have elected to schedule your event on the Lord's Day. Nevertheless, thank you for the invitation as well as the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Dina.
I'd like to address an issue that probably is most serious and pressing of all, yet receives little to no attention from the Republican supermajority, and that's gun safety. In the Senate, I will be a voice for safety-first gun ownership. As someone who served in the military, I have a unique firsthand experience and perspective. I had world-class weapons training in the Army. That included locking up our weapons for safe storage. I applaud programs like the one from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office that offers free gun safety locks to secure guns, but we don't have nearly enough safety-first requirements for gun owners in Kansas. The latest deadly school shooting was still more proof that we need more common sense, safety-first measures as supported by Moms Demand Action, from keeping guns unloaded and locked away to stricter background checks and red flag policies. What we don't need is more of the do-nothing approach from NRA-endorsed office holders, my opponent included. I'm proud to say I'm endorsed by Moms Demand Action, who know we have to address this very serious public safety issue. When elected, I will be a strong and uniquely qualified ally for Moms Demand Action and related efforts to keep Kansans safe at school, safe at work, and safe at home.
Thank you. Next, we have Tyler.
This is Tyler Weibel's response. I am a 6th-generation Kansan. I feel very honored to have a chance to run in this district, a district that its borderlines surround the area I have spent my whole life. This district encompasses my friends, my neighbors, my family, and the entirety of who I am. I love Kansas and the people that I have been so lucky to meet throughout my life here, the history, the connection everyone has, and the future that it is yet to come. I come to you as someone who wants nothing but the very best representation of the needs and wants of my community at the state level. Once elected, that is my sole mission, to better the lives of all those I hold so dearly. So I ask you to look past the local race as a party divide. I don't care who your presidential candidate choice is or your party alignment. This local election isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This is about Kansans being in charge of Kansas again. I want to represent each and every one of you to the best of my abilities and make our home a place to be proud of. Thank you all.
Thank you. Next, we have Marcy.
I echo the concerns for gun safety, so we'll go on to address two other issues. I've heard a lot about property tax increases during the campaign. I co-sponsored Senate Bill 2 with Senator Holland during the special legislative session to prioritize property tax relief over income tax for the wealthiest Kansans. While the tax bill that passed spent nearly all the budget surplus, I'll be watching budget projections carefully to see what sustainable property tax relief can be implemented. The minimum wage in 22 states, including Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota, increased at the beginning of this year, but it remains at the federal level of $7.25 in Kansas. We've spent billions for economic development and corporate tax reductions over the years. It's time to require a livable wage. The issues most important to me are the ones that I hear about from my constituents. Please let me know what is of concern to you, and I'll see how we might work together to best address those issues. And thank you to all the sponsors of today's debate. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you.